I want to do today is talk a little bit about the science of climate change and then spend most of my time with you on the Paris Climate Accords, what they are, how they came to be, and the very, very modest role that I had in those accords. Let me start at the beginning. I was a brand new baby mayor in 2004 when I was invited to join 19 other mayors for 3 days at Sundance, Utah, to help develop a strategy for the mayors of America around global warming. I knew almost nothing about the subject. It hadn't registered yet for me as one of those big issues that mayors deal with, like how do you fill the potholes or pick up the garbage. I didn't know what climate change was. I didn't know what global warming was, but the trip was underwritten by the U.S. Conference of Mayors and by the Robert Redford Institute, so off I went for 3 days in a beautiful part of our country with a very cool group of mayors. I was soon to learn that these 3 days would change my life, change the way I understood leadership, and then send me in a direction of learning, of scholarship that I'd never even thought of before. Joining us at Sundance, along with for these 20 mayors, was Vice President Al Gore. Shortly after he had been defeated at the hands of the Supreme Court, he immersed himself in the knowledge of climate change, the science of climate change, global warming as we referred to it at that time. And he put together what he called a little slideshow to show us. We watched the show, and then we spent several hours talking with the vice president, with Robert Redford, who was with us for the 3 days, with the scientists that the conference had assembled to help us understand these issues better. And we walked the trails around Sundance, Utah in 2s and 3s, talking earnestly about what we were learning and what difference it was going to make when we got back home. And to a person, this group of 20 mayors left that conference clear-eyed and convinced that we were the advance guard to protect the planet. Now, of course, the little slideshow that Al Gore showed became the basis for his film, An Inconvenient Truth, and the vice president received the Nobel Peace Prize, and a generation of climate deniers arose to challenge us climate evangelists. So today I'm going to start where I am the least comfortable, and I want to give you a huge disclaimer. I am not a scientist. I don't think like a scientist. I don't process like a scientist. I don't reason like a scientist. But that said, I've read a lot of science on climate change, and I've spoken with many climate scientists over the last 2 decades, and I think I can reasonably represent the science. Now, Bill McKibben wasn't the first scientist to identify global average temperature rise, nor was he the first to propose that the rise was the result of human-based activities, but he popularized the science in a book called The End of Nature. It's very readable, very accessible for non-scientists like me. The End of Nature laid out the causes and the effects. It forecast the climate conditions, and it sounded the kind of a bugle call that Rachel Carson had sounded in 1962 when she wrote Silent Spring. About the time that McKibben's book came out, I was in mourning. I was mourning the fact that my hiking buddy, my son Damien, had gone off to college and he'd discovered girdles, and he was no longer interested in backpacking with his old man. So I loaded up my pack and I headed off on a solo hike on the Appalachian Trail through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. 5 days, 52 miles of stunning natural beauty, and in October I had it pretty much to myself. I chose a a west to east route through the park, and I ascended from Lake Fontana. And 3 days into the hike, I was following a ridge line, looking out across wave after wave after wave of beautiful valleys and ridges, when I noticed something stunning. At this elevation, the woods around me were all conifers, and they were all dead. Back at the ranger station at the end of the hike, I asked about this. Acid rain, said the ranger. Toxic gases trapped in the atmosphere, held in saturated clouds, and then raining down on all those once lovely pine trees, now just brown sticks. The experience helped me understand at least the principle behind climate change. You see, the earth was created with this amazing ability to take carbon dioxide and methane gas, the gases that are naturally produced in nature, and convert them or retain them so that they don't reach levels that are harmful to life on the planet. Trees and plants and grass, even algae, trap CO2 from the air and with a little help from the sun through a process called photosynthesis. We learned about it in middle school. Produce the oxygen that we need to live. And it isn't only the green things that sequester this carbon. The greatest carbon sink, as it's called, is the oceans of the world. Now, nature maintains this perfect balance in the atmosphere through the normal life of the planet. No more CO2 or methane are produced than can be stored in green life and in the oceans. But we humans have messed with the stasis, messed with the balance. We discovered that those carbon-trapping green things of long, long ago, buried in the earth over geological time, could be extracted and they could be used in beneficial ways in our lives. Coal could heat our homes and cook our food. It could boil the water that turned the steam that powered our very first engines. It could be burned to turn the turbines that gave us, the generators that gave us electricity. Petroleum products could be used to fire our internal combustion engines. And pretty soon our use of carbon-based fuels was producing more CO2 than nature could absorb. Now comes what they call the greenhouse effect. Earth's atmosphere, this incredibly thin blanket of gases surrounding the Earth, has existed for billions of years and has allowed for the formation and the evolution of life on our home planet. There have been periodic fluctuations as the result, periodic fluctuations in the composition of that atmosphere over geological time. And those fluctuations result in more or less of the sun's energy being able to reach the Earth's surface, more or less of Earth's natural production of gases that's been able to escape. In Al Gore's little slideshow, he graphs the global CO2 concentrations over millions of years. And yes, there are natural periods of lesser and greater concentration on that chart, until we come to the industrial age of human habitation, the time when carbon-based fuels came to be used, and the line blows off the top of the chart. Now here's the other thing about the atmosphere. It allows the sun's energy to come through, but it traps the gases that are produced on Earth. And those trapped gases retain the sun's heat, resulting in warming of the surface of the Earth. This is the greenhouse effect, and the atmosphere acts like a glass greenhouse. Now, many things happen when the Earth's atmosphere rises. Animals that lived in one climate must either move to another climate or become extinct. Oceans become chemically unbalanced, and ocean life changes. Coral reefs that protected the shorelines of many of our ocean geography. Well, they can't move, and so they die. Ice caps melt at alarming rates, and areas are inundated. Entire communities, even now, around the world, are being forced to relocate to areas where they can safely escape the rise of the seas. And much more of this is going to occur in the years to come. Weather patterns change, storms become more intense and more frequent. Extreme rain events, we've experienced those here in West Michigan, cause rivers to rise and flood their banks. Extreme heat events cause animals and plant life great stress, and those extreme heat events can even kill people, elderly people, sick people. And this is only a short list of the impacts. It doesn't start to catalog the human suffering that comes with social upheaval, famine, drought. 16 of the last 17 years have established record highs for global average temperatures. You may have heard that scientists disagree on this subject, and Dr. Hoffman's presentation addressed that this morning, because science must continually change, test its assumptions and theories, or it isn't truly science. And because this is such a rapidly evolving field of research, there are new discoveries, new evidence, new data to test the theory and to adjust the theory. But here's the truth, and remember it from the first presentation. No credible scientist or scientific association today disagrees on the fact of climate change or on its human-based causes. Now, what I want to do now is talk about the Paris Accords. That was really the challenge I was given today. And I want to set out the major tenets of the Paris Climate Conference. We'll call them the Climate Accords today. Describe the process for its development as I was able to observe it in Paris, and then finally look at what it really means. That is, what will we have to do to achieve its goals? So here's the bones of the agreement. First, every participating nation, 196 of us, was required to submit its goals for greenhouse gas reduction in advance of the conference. This was an enormous breakthrough. Neither the important Kyoto Climate Change Agreement of 1997 that Dr. Hoffman referenced, nor any of the subsequent climate agreements had required nations to set measurable goals, verifiable goals of their own. I'll say more about how that happened, but what's important to note here is that if you pull up the agreement, you're going to see an appendix that lists the goals of all 196 nations of the world. Second, the agreement sets a long-term goal of maintaining global temperature average increase at no more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above the temperature of the pre-industrial age. Furthermore, the agreement states that nations will pursue efforts to keep the rise of temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the stretch goal for us. And by the year 2050, the agreement says that man-made emissions of greenhouse gases should not exceed the ability of the Earth to absorb. Third, beginning in 2020, this year, and every 5 years thereafter, nations are going to be required to report their progress on the goals and to establish new goals, stretch goals. You see the cumulative effect of all 196 nations' goals that they set still doesn't achieve the 2 degrees Celsius cap. It's higher than that. So we've got to get progressively more stringent in our goal setting, aggressive in our goal setting. And fourth, there's also a requirement that the developed nations provide financial support to the less wealthy nations, the developing nations, to allow them to leapfrog technologies and make other investments in emissions reduction. Let me give you an example. A developing nation finds to meet the needs of new industry in their country, they have to put in a new electric power generating plant, and the cheapest way to do that, the cheapest way to build it, the cheapest fuel that they could use, they find is coal. They can go to the bank, in effect, that the developed nations, the wealthy nations of the world have set up, and they can tap that bank to be able to afford to pay the difference to put in more renewable energy, solar or wind-powered energy, and so that is still in its infancy, but it's there for developing nations to use. So in just four very broad brushstrokes, that's what the agreement is. Here's what it isn't. It isn't binding on any nation. These nationally determined contributions, as they're called, these goals, are just that. They're goals that each nation sets for itself. It must measure and report, and there's an independent verification process, but there are no penalties if you miss the mark on any reporting period. And secondly, those goals collectively, they do exceed the 2% cap. So we need to keep tightening the screws to make this, if this is going to work. And third, the agreement is clearly the product of the political will of the nations that were assembled at that point in time. Administrations change, regimes change, political ideologies ebb and flow. And the document must withstand the challenges from any rogue nation and flex to meet the changing political will as well as scientific advances. So, notwithstanding these three shortcomings that I just pointed out, I still contend that the Paris Climate Accord is one of the most significant events in our lifetime. Let me tell you about the conference setting, the Le Bourget in Paris on the northern outskirts, this massive complex that's used for international trade shows in that space. In the center of the complex is an area where all the negotiations took place. Only the diplomats could enter that space. The blue zone, which was the next concentric circle, was the area to which my credentials gave me access. And in the blue zone, each participating nation set up its own pavilion, and the delegates would periodically come out to the blue zone to hold meetings, to get advice and counsel, to seek insights, to give updates on what was going on inside. And then beyond the blue zone was what was called the green zone, and that's where all the non-governmental organizations, the nonprofit organizations of the world had gathered to try to figure out how we were going to take these tenets of the agreement and make them practical on the ground. And before the negotiators arrived at Le Bourget, the nations had to all submit their goals. This was a very important thing. And then at the beginning of the conference, several of the world leaders, including our own president, Barack Obama, addressed the gathered diplomats and set the stage for the negotiations that would follow. And then the next step was for the sort of the mid-level diplomats to begin working on the agreement, attempting to negotiate away any disagreements, what they called bracketed clauses in the agreement before their bosses arrived. And it was during this first week that those of us who inhabited the blue zone had our best access to the process. We met with our State Department negotiating team. We met with White House staff who were representing the president in the negotiations. We received reports. We had opportunities to give them feedback. we encouraged, and we criticized. And then in week 2, the big guns came to town, the ministerial level delegate, including our own Secretary of State, John Kerry, who stepped in to finish out, some of the stickiest of these disagreements between the 196 nations. A couple of the most difficult were, when would the first 5-year evaluation occur? Remember, this is 2015. When would the first 5-year evaluation occur? Some people suggested that should be 2025 or even 2030. And then the second area that was very contentious was whether these goals should be mandatory, required that nations achieve the goals with some penalty if they didn't. As one of 37 U.S. mayors who were urging our negotiators to adopt the strongest possible position on both of these issues, I would say that we won one battle and we lost the other. The one we won, 5 years is 5 years. And so in 2020, this year, the end of this year, by December of this year, nations will report out, including the United States, will report out our progress on achieving our goals under the Paris agreements. With respect to mandatory goals, and punitive measures for missing goals, we lost that. We were told by our State Department that voluntary compliance was the best that we would be able to achieve. I want to editorialize a little bit on what the agreement means and where we go from here. Were it not for what happened on December 4th of 2015, I think I might be more skeptical about the prospects of the Paris Accord. On that day, December 4th, 2015, in City Hall, Paris, 600 mayors of the world gathered at the call of Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo and former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And the day was, I think, perhaps one of the most inspiring in my life. We knew that if these accords were going to be meaningful, if they were going to achieve that aggressive 1.5 degree cap, it would only be to the extent that cities implemented strategies around renewable energy, transportation, building design, heat island reduction, tree planting, wetland protection. In other words, we understood that the success of the international agreements depended on local government. We U.S. mayors met with 8 of our U.S. senators who attended the conference. We talked about legislative needs, and we secured commitments from those senators to try. We met with White House staff. We encouraged the administration to be aggressive in their use of executive orders. We heard from U.S. EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy, U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz. We caucused and we kibitzed and we bragged, because that's what mayors do, and we promised. And I can tell you again that to a person, 600 mayors left Paris convinced that we were responsible for carrying out the goals of the agreement. We are confident that any progress made will be made in cities, and it will stun the diplomats when those goals are announced, when that report out is given at the end of this year. As mayors, we traveled from Paris December of 2015, certain that nothing could stand against the power of this movement. And then we had a change of U.S. administration. And what seemed impossible actually happened. A climate denier was elected president of the United States. And he promptly put in other climate deniers in some of the key positions in his administration, including the EPA administrator, the Secretary of State, the Energy Secretary. And one of the early orders of business in this administration was to withdraw the United States from the Paris Accords, to make us the first rogue nation. Withdrawal isn't as simple as saying, we out of here. There's a process, and that process takes some time. But effectively, the parallel rollback of Obama-era executive orders is permitting a business-as-usual polluting approach, and the lack of enforcement by the EPA virtually guarantees that by the time we get to this first reporting period, we will be pretty far down the road toward violating our Paris Accord goals. This overriding of the executive orders, the Obama executive orders, is particularly hard for me because I was one of a small team that spent over a year working on President Obama's task force of city and state and tribal leaders, a group that formulated the very policies that President Obama used with those climate protecting orders. In spite of this, I am still optimistic. Why? Because first, when Trump announced withdrawal from Paris, business was already traveling and had already traveled pretty far down the road, leading to a cleaner future. And while some manufacturers will turn back, others will continue to press on. Second, lenders, bankers of the world are beginning to refuse loans where climate disasters might happen or for companies that might be major polluters. And insurance companies are more often denying casualty insurance to these same companies. And third, I'm optimistic because the citizens of America, including you in this room, have been conscientized, and the purchasing decisions that we're making and the political votes that we're casting and the public advocacy efforts that we're doing are increasingly being driven by our new understandings. Dr. John Holdren, who was the director of the Obama White House Office of Science and Technology, said, if we want to avoid a catastrophic effect if we want to avoid the catastrophic effects surrounding climate change, we have got to turn this problem around now. That was in 2014, and ever since then we've set records for global average temperature rise. So friends, I think that Dr. Holdren's challenge is a challenge that's directed at us. It's a challenge to how we live, how we do business, how we respect the earth, how we value our future, how we think, how we act, how we vote. It's easy to look at the magnitude of this problem and conclude that nothing can be done to reverse this phenomenon, or that our small contribution doesn't make a difference. But Pope Francis, writing about climate change, wrote this: what would induce anyone at this time to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? The Pope's words serve as a reminder to leaders at all levels of government that they must not squander the political capital that they have right now. But I want to conclude my remarks here today by suggesting as well that each of us has a responsibility to act. Each of us have had our eyes open to the plight of the earth. We've heard Earth's cry. We know the historic rate of species extinction. We've seen the suffering of humanity in climate's bullseye. We can't claim ignorance. Neither can we rest on our past accomplishments. Last August, with 3 grandsons, I canoed the lakes of the Sylvania Wilderness in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. We paddled on crystal clear water past shorelines that were dense with cedar and fir and spotted with centuries-old virgin white pine trees. We saw eagles and loons, fox and deer and mink. And my commitment deepened as the air, fresh and crisp in the morning, said, "Thank you." And the soil under the white pines, spongy and sweet-smelling, said, "You must do more." And the water, cold and clear beneath our canoe, said, "The universe will give you everything you need, the strength, the courage, the wisdom." And the eagle said, "Don't be afraid." Paris showed us the way. It's up to us to go there. Thanks for listening.